In 1992, a woman vanished after a frantic 911 call from a payphone. 31 years later, a hidden whisper on that old tape changed everything. Her name was Sarah. She was 24. On a cold October night, she had called for help, her voice thin and breaking, lost in a crackle of static and fear. She gave a street, a corner. Then the line went dead. Police arrived minutes later. The payphone receiver dangled off the hook, swinging a little in the night breeze. But Sarah was gone. Just gone. There were no witnesses, no struggle, no obvious clues left behind. Only the echo of her terror on a dispatcher's recording. For years, that tape was all they had. Her last known words. Investigators listened to it over and over. Her family listened, desperate for something, anything they might have missed. Her older sister, Emily, played it until the words became a ghostly litany, a soundtrack to her grief. Sarah's plea, then the click, then nothing. What happened in those final seconds? What horror had silenced her? The case grew cold, filed away with so many others, a name on a list, a box of fading reports. The city changed around the spot where Sarah last stood. Time buried the questions deeper. Then, in 2023, something shifted. A new cold case unit, armed with technology unimaginable in 1992, decided to re-examine old evidence. Sarah's case was on their list. The 911 tape, now a digitized file, was sent for audio enhancement. They weren't expecting much. Maybe a clearer word, a background noise previously obscured. Standard procedure. The audio engineer, a young man named Ben, put on his headphones. He heard Sarah's panic, the familiar heartbreaking sounds. He filtered out the hiss, the hum of the old phone line. He amplified the quiet spaces between her words. And that's when he heard it. Faint, almost buried beneath the sound of Sarah's own breathing, was something else. A whisper. He isolated the segment. Listened again. His skin went cold. It was a man's voice, low and sibilant, repeating a single word. Her name. Sarah, Sarah. Over and over, like a chilling caress. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't the dispatcher. It was someone else. Someone there with her, or near her, at that payphone. Someone who hadn't been on any report. The discovery sent a shockwave through the small unit. 31 years of silence, and now this, a ghost voice from the past. The implications were enormous. Who was this man? Was he the reason she called 911? Was he the one who took her? The whisper wasn't angry, not explosive. It was something worse, possessive, calm. It sounded like he was right beside her, so close. How had no one heard it before? The technology, they said. It could pull threads of sound from a wall of noise. Emily was called in. They sat her down in a quiet room. Detective Miller, a man who'd inherited the case files years ago, looked tired, but his eyes held a new light. He explained what they'd found. He warned her it might be difficult. Emily just nodded. She'd lived with difficult for 3 decades. They played the enhanced section. First, Sarah's panicked words, achingly familiar. Then, as the engineer pointed to the waveform on the screen, the whisper emerged. Sarah, Sarah! Emily closed her eyes. Her hand went to her mouth. It was like a physical blow. All these years, she'd imagined Sarah alone, terrified. But this was different. This meant someone was with her, someone she possibly knew, someone whose presence was a threat so immediate she had risked that call. The whisper was soft, yet it filled the room, filled the silence of 31 years. It was intimate, and it was terrifying. What did it mean? And who did it belong to? The old wound, scarred over by time, was ripped open again, raw and bleeding. But this time, Mixed with the pain, there was something else. A tiny, dangerous spark of hope. Or perhaps just a new kind of dread. The payphone. That was the key, always had been. The last place Sarah was known to be alive. The source of the only direct evidence they had. Her voice, and now this other, chilling voice. Detective Miller pulled out the old case files. Maps, crime scene photos of the empty phone booth. He remembered visiting the location himself, years ago, when he first took over the cold cases. Even then, it felt like chasing ghosts. The first, most obvious question: where was this payphone now? The whisper made its location more critical than ever. Could there be something, anything, still there? Miller flipped through the reports. 1992. Corner of Elm Street and Oak Avenue. A busy intersection back then, near a bus stop and a small, 24-hour diner. A younger detective, Chen, did a quick search on his computer. His face fell. He turned the screen to Miller. An article from a local newspaper, dated 1994. Old city landmarks make way for progress. There was a picture of a wrecking ball, a pile of rubble. The caption mentioned the demolition of several old structures on Elm Street to make way for a new mini-mall. The payphone and the small newsstand it had stood beside were gone, torn down just 2 years after Sarah vanished. A dead end. Again, Miller felt the familiar frustration tighten his chest. 31 years. And it felt like they were always one step behind, the past always being paved over, erased. Emily, when she was told, simply nodded. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She'd learned to live with dead ends. What's one more? But the whisper had changed something for Miller. It was a direct taunt from the past. He couldn't let it go. That payphone was a crime scene. Even if the structure itself was gone, what about the ground it stood on? Could something have been dropped, buried, forgotten? It was a long shot, a desperate, almost foolish idea. He looked at Chen. Chen looked back, understanding the unspoken question. He said, "Elm and Oak. That's now the parking lot for the Value Mart, isn't it?" Miller nodded. Concrete, asphalt, layers of new development. The whisper, "Sarah, Sarah." It wouldn't leave him. It was a hook, pulling him towards that spot. He thought of the family, of Emily, 31 years of not knowing. If there was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, didn't they have to take it? He made a call to the city planning department. He needed old blueprints, schematics from before 1994. He needed to know exactly where that payphone had stood, not just the corner, but the precise footprint. Emily heard about Miller's plan. She didn't say much, just, "Thank you." Her voice was quiet. She wouldn't let herself hope too much. She'd been down that road before, but she also knew Miller. He was like a quiet, relentless bulldog when he caught a scent. A few days later, they had the old city plans. Faded blue lines on brittle paper. There it was, a small square marking the concrete pad for the telephone utility box and the booth. Miller overlaid it with a current satellite image of the Value Mart parking lot. It looked like the spot was near a storm drain, close to the edge of the paved area, under a section that was mostly used for overflow parking. Perhaps not as deeply buried under new construction as they'd feared. Getting permission to dig was another hurdle. The Value Mart Corporation wasn't thrilled. Disruption, potential liability. Miller had to pull strings, call in favors. He emphasized the seriousness of the cold case, the new audio evidence. Finally, they agreed. A small section, for a limited time. So, on a gray morning, Detective Miller, Chen, and a small team from forensics stood on the edge of a windswept parking lot. Shoppers glanced at them, curious. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and stale fast food. It felt a world away from 1992. Miller looked at the spot marked with temporary orange paint. Concrete. So much concrete. What could possibly be left after all this time? They were literally digging into the past, sifting through layers of forgetting. The whisper seemed to hang in the air around them, a question mark. Was this a fool's errand? Or was something still waiting, hidden beneath their feet? The jackhammer shattered the morning quiet. It bit into the asphalt, then the concrete layer beneath. Dust filled the air. Miller watched, his jaw tight. This was it, the point of no return. If they found nothing, this was likely the end of this particular thread. The whisper would remain an isolated, chilling mystery. The work was slow, methodical. They had to be careful. The old plans indicated utility lines might be nearby, though most should have been rerouted or removed during the 1994 demolition. The crew dug by hand once they were through the main concrete slab of the parking lot. Shovels scraped against gravel, dirt, and the debris of years. Old bottle caps, rusty nails, plastic fragments. The detritus of a throwaway world. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, weak and watery. Chen wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt. Nothing. Just soil, compacted and dense. Miller felt a familiar, sinking feeling. He'd authorized this. His reputation, the department's resources, on what was looking more and more like a hunch, fueled by a 30-year-old whisper. He glanced at the faces of the forensic team. They were professional, diligent, but he could see the doubt creeping in. He walked over to the edge of the excavation. It was about 4 feet deep now, a neat rectangle cut into the earth. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Emily's face when she heard that whisper. He couldn't give up yet. 1 more foot, he told the crew. Just 1 more foot down. The shovels bit into the earth again, and then one of them hit something that wasn't rock or compacted soil. A dull thud. The worker paused. He prodded gently with the shovel's edge. It felt soft. Not solid like a pipe or a forgotten piece of foundation. He knelt, brushing away the loose dirt with his gloved hands. Miller and Chen moved closer, their breath held. Slowly, a patch of color emerged from the brown earth. Faded, yes, but definitely not soil. It was fabric, a floral pattern, barely visible under the grime. Blues and yellows, maybe, on a pale background. More digging, carefully now, with trowels and brushes. The patch of fabric grew larger. It seemed to be wrapped around something roughly rectangular. Miller's heart began to pound. This was too specific, too deliberate to be random trash. Fabric didn't just appear 4 feet under a demolished payphone site by accident. The team worked with renewed urgency, yet with extreme care. The earth was damp, and the fabric was fragile in places. As they cleared more soil, the shape became clearer. It was a bundle, wrapped tightly in what looked like a bedsheet. A motel bedsheet, Miller thought, his mind racing. The pattern was cheap, institutional. One of the forensic techs, a woman named Ramirez, looked up at Miller. Her eyes were wide. She said, "Detective, there's something inside. It's heavy, solid." The air grew thick with unspoken questions. What had they found? After 31 years, buried beneath layers of concrete and forgetting, a secret was about to be disturbed. The whisper on the tape suddenly felt very close, very real. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a signpost, pointing them here, to this moment, to this faded piece of cloth, holding its contents like a long-kept, dark promise. The dig had yielded more than just dirt. It had yielded a tangible link to that night. The bundle was carefully lifted from the earth, cradled like a fragile relic. They placed it on a sterile tarp laid out beside the excavation site. The faded floral bedsheet stained with earth and time, was tied shut with what looked like its own torn corner. Someone had made a deliberate effort to secure its contents. A hush fell over the small group. Even the distant traffic sounds of Value Mart seemed to recede. Ramirez, the forensic tech, carefully began to work at the knot. Her gloved fingers moved with precision. The knot was tight, stiffened by years in the damp ground. Finally, it gave way. She began to unwrap the bedsheet, fold by fold. The fabric was surprisingly intact in some places, rotted through in others. As the last layer was pulled back, the object within was revealed. It lay there, caked in mud but unmistakable. A portable cassette recorder. An old model from the 80s or early 90s. The kind teenagers used to make mixtapes, or reporters for quick interviews. Small, black, plastic. A collective intake of breath. Miller stared at it. A cassette recorder. Why would this be buried here? Beneath a payphone, where a woman made a desperate 911 call before vanishing. The whisper on the tape, "Sarah, Sarah." Was this connected? It had to be. Ramirez examined it closely. "There's a tape inside," she said, her voice quiet. "And look at this." She pointed to the control buttons. The play and record buttons were both depressed, pushed down hard and seemingly jammed in that position. The battery compartment, when she carefully opened it, contained only the corroded remnants of 2 AA batteries. They had leaked and died decades ago. But the position of those buttons, it suggested the recorder had been active, either playing or recording. When it was buried, it had been left running until the power gave out. The implications hit Miller with force. Someone was there with Sarah, someone with a tape recorder, someone who had then buried it. Was it Sarah's recorder? Or did it belong to the person who whispered her name? The bedsheet, that pattern. It screamed motel. Had Sarah been at a motel? Or had her abductor come from one, bringing this sheet? Chen voiced the question that hung in the air. "What's on the tape, boss?" That was the multi-million-dollar question. 31 years. Had this little plastic box held the answers all along, silently waiting in the dark? The tape itself was a standard ferric oxide cassette. It might be degraded, it might be blank, or it might contain something that could finally break the case wide open. Ramirez carefully ejected the cassette. It came out with a faint click. She held it up. TDK D60. She read from the label. A common 60-minute tape. There was no handwritten label on it, just the manufacturer's markings. She placed it in a sterile evidence bag. This needed to go straight to the lab, to the audio specialists, the same ones who found the whisper. The discovery of the recorder, found because of a whisper on another tape, felt surreal. It was like the past was unspooling, layer by layer. The bedsheet, too, was bagged as evidence. It would be analyzed. Maybe it held DNA, fibers, something. Miller looked back at the hole in the ground. Just a few hours ago, it was an anonymous parking lot. Now, it was a tomb that had yielded a secret. He thought of the whisper again. "Sarah, Sarah," was the voice on this new tape. Would they finally hear more than just her name? The team packed up. The hole would be refilled. Value Mart could have its parking spot back. But something had fundamentally changed. They weren't just chasing a 31-year-old echo anymore. They had something new, something physical, something that had been there. As they drove away, Miller held the evidence bag containing the small cassette. It felt impossibly heavy. The little spools hadn't turned in decades. But what had they captured before they stopped? What horrors, or what truths, were locked in the magnetic dust of that fragile ribbon? The anticipation was almost unbearable. The forensic audio lab was a small, soundproofed room filled with equipment that looked both cutting-edge and strangely retro. Ben, the young engineer who'd found the whisper on the 911 call, was waiting. He looked nervous, excited. The cassette tape, carefully cleaned and prepared, sat ready in a specialized vintage cassette deck, wired into his modern digital audio workstation. Detective Miller and Emily, Sarah's sister, were there. Miller had hesitated to bring Emily, but she had insisted. "I've waited this long," she said, her voice firm. "I need to hear it. Whatever it is." Ben pressed play. The speakers hissed. A long, drawn-out hiss of blank tape. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Miller exchanged a glance with Emily. Was it empty? Had all this been for nothing? Then, a click. A muffled sound, like fabric rubbing against a microphone. Another click. And then, voices. Not Sarah's voice. Not at first. A man's voice. Low, calm, too calm. He wasn't speaking clearly, as if the recorder was in a pocket, or hidden. Words were indistinct, but the tone, it was conversational, yet somehow devoid of warmth. Then, another voice. Sarah. Her voice was strained, tight, but not panicked, like on the 911 call. This was different. This sounded like an argument, or a tense negotiation. Emily leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Her face was a mask of concentration. The man said something. A phrase came through clearly. "Don't have to be this way." Sarah replied. Her words were sharper now. "Just leave me alone. I'm serious." The quality was poor. There were bumps, thuds, the sound of movement. It was raw, unfiltered. It felt like being a hidden observer to something intensely private and deeply wrong. Then, another sound emerged from the background hiss, faint but unmistakable. The jingle of keys. The distant rumble of traffic from Elm Street. This recording was made outdoors, or near an open door or window. The conversation continued, fragmented. The man's voice remained unnervingly level. Sarah's grew more agitated. "I told you no," she said, her voice rising. And then, the moment that made everyone in the room freeze. The man's voice, suddenly closer to the microphone, clearer than before. He whispered, "Sarah, Sarah." It was him. The same cadence, the same chillingly intimate tone as the whisper on the 911 tape. But here, on this new tape, it wasn't overlaid with Sarah's panicked breathing or the dispatcher's questions. It was clearer, undiluted. Emily let out a small, choked gasp. Her eyes were fixed on the speakers, as if she could see the man standing there. The tape continued. Sarah's voice again, now with a definite edge of fear. "What are you doing? Stay away from me!" There was a scuffling sound, a thump, as if the recorder had been dropped or jostled violently. The man's voice no longer calm, but hard, guttural. "You're not going anywhere." Then, another sound began to overlay the scuffle. Faintly at first, then louder. The distinct, metallic clicks of a payphone rotary dial, or the beeps of push buttons. Sarah was making the 911 call. This tape, this hidden recorder, was capturing the event from the perpetrator's perspective, or at least from his immediate vicinity. He was there with her, as she called for help. Her voice, now distant but recognizable from the 911 tape. "Need police. Elm and Oak." The man on the new tape swore, a vicious, angry sound. Then, a muffled scream, Sarah's scream, cut short, followed by a series of dull, sickening thuds. And then, silence. Not just silence. The tape kept running for a long, long time. The hiss of empty air, the occasional faint, distant sound of night traffic, but no more voices, no more struggle. Just the sound of the recorder, silently documenting the aftermath of What? Ben stopped the tape. The room was deathly quiet. Emily was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Miller felt a cold rage settle in his stomach. This was it. This was the horror Sarah had faced, recorded by her attacker. The mid-spike was undeniable. They had heard her last moments, not just her call for help, but the attack itself. The whisperer was the attacker. He had recorded his crime. The silence on the rest of the tape was a chilling testament to his success in silencing her. The tape wasn't just evidence. It was a violation, a grotesque trophy, and it had been buried, as if to preserve that terrible moment forever. What kind of monster were they dealing with? The sound of those thuds. Miller didn't want to imagine what they were, but he knew. And he knew this case had just become very, very real again. The question now was, who was this man with the calm voice and the brutal hands, and could they find him after 31 years? The motel bedsheet. That was the next concrete piece of the puzzle. The floral pattern, faded but distinct. It felt like a deliberate signature left at the scene, or perhaps just a convenient item used in haste. Miller tasked Chen with the job. Find out which motel, if any, used that pattern in or around 1992. It was a needle in a haystack kind of search. Chen started by calling laundry services that had operated in the area back then. Most were long out of business, their records gone. He visited archives, looking for old advertisements for motels, hoping to spot a similar pattern in a grainy photo of a room interior. Days went by with no luck. The pattern was generic enough that it could have come from anywhere, or been discontinued quickly. Meanwhile, Emily, devastated but resolute after hearing the second tape, tried to dredge up memories from that period. Sarah had been working at a downtown bookstore. She was saving up for a community college course. She was independent, a little bit shy, but with a good group of friends. Was there anyone new in her life around October 1992? Anyone who made her uncomfortable? Emily closed her eyes, trying to picture Sarah back then. It was so long ago. So many details had faded. She remembered Sarah complaining about a customer at the bookstore, someone who stared too much. But that was vague, a fleeting comment. There were dates, a few casual ones, but no serious boyfriend at the time. Nothing that stood out as a red flag in retrospect. The voice on the tape, that calm, possessive whisper, "Sarah, Sarah." It haunted Emily. Did she know that voice? She played it in her mind over and over. It was a man's voice, no strong accent. It sounded ordinary. That was the most chilling part. The voice of a monster could be the voice of anyone. The motel bedsheet lead finally got a break. Chen had expanded his search to include old suppliers of hotel linens. He found a retired salesman who had worked for a textile company in the early 90s. Chen emailed him a cleaned-up photo of the pattern from the bedsheet. The salesman called back a day later. "Yes," he said, his voice crackling over the phone. "I remember that one. Called Spring Meadow. We sold a ton of it, mostly to budget places. Motels, small, independent hotels." Could he remember any specific clients in their city? The salesman paused. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but there was one, the Blue Jay Inn, out on Highway 17, near the old Elm Street exit. They bought a lot of our cheaper lines. I think Spring Meadow was one of them." The Blue Jay Inn. Miller knew the name. It was still there, though it had changed hands and names a couple of times. Back in 1992, it had a reputation. A place people went when they didn't want to be seen. Transient, a bit seedy. And it was only about a 5-minute drive from the corner of Elm and Oak where the Payphone had stood. 3 blocks, as the original prompt hinted. This was a strong lead. The bedsheet, a physical object from the burial site, could now be linked to a specific place. A place where Sarah's killer might have stayed, or worked, or frequented. Miller and Chen drove out to the current iteration of the Blue Jay Inn. It was now called the Starlight Motor Lodge, but the building was clearly the same. Run down, paint peeling. The clerk on duty was young, had no knowledge of 1992. Guest logs from that far back? Long gone, he said with a shrug. Probably thrown out years ago during one of the ownership changes. Disappointment. But Miller hadn't expected it to be easy. The connection was the key. The bedsheet came from a place like this. The man on the tape, the one who whispered Sarah's name, might have brought that sheet from the Blue Jay Inn, used it to wrap the recorder, maybe even used it for other things. They focused back on the tape. Were there any other sounds? Anything that could point to the killer's identity or habits? Ben, the audio engineer, was still working on it, trying to clean it up further, isolate fainter noises. Emily, meanwhile, kept searching her memory. The Blue Jay Inn, did Sarah ever mention it? No, she was sure Sarah would never have gone to a place like that. So, if the killer was connected to it, he was someone outside Sarah's usual circle. The case was narrowing. The whisper, the recorder, the bedsheet, the motel, these were no longer disparate floating pieces. They were starting to connect, forming the faint outline of a shadow that had a voice that called Sarah's name with chilling intimacy before it silenced her. The question remained, could they put a face to that shadow after all this time? The Blue Jay Inn felt like the next place to dig. Metaphorically this time. What secrets did its past hold? The Blue Jay Inn. Even if the current management had no records from 1992, the place itself was a constant. Miller started looking into old police reports connected to the motel around that time. Were there any disturbances, any arrests, any missing persons cases linked to it? Anything that might involve a man fitting the vague profile they were building, someone capable of calm manipulation and sudden violence. The voice on the tape. They had psychologists listen to it. The consensus was unsettling. The speaker displayed traits of possessiveness, control, and a chilling detachment. The way he repeated Sarah's name, both on the 911 call background and on the second tape, was described as almost a form of branding, a claim of ownership. It wasn't just a name, it was an assertion. Who was this man? The lack of a clear suspect was maddening. They had his voice, but a voice isn't a fingerprint. Not in a way that could easily be searched against a database from that era. Emily continued to rack her brain. Sarah had been careful. She wouldn't have willingly put herself in a dangerous situation with a stranger. This suggested the man was someone who could have gained her trust, at least initially, or someone who was adept at cornering his victims. She remembered something Sarah had said a few weeks before she disappeared. She'd been a bit down, talking about how hard it was to meet decent people. She'd mentioned going to a coffee shop after work sometimes, just to read and be around people. Maybe she'd met someone there, but it was all so vague. The investigation into the Blue Jay Inn's past turned up a few minor arrests for disorderly conduct, some domestic disputes reported from its rooms, but nothing that directly linked to Sarah or offered a clear suspect for her abduction and murder. It was a place where people passed through, often leaving no trace. Then Chen, painstakingly going through microfiched local newspapers from late 1992 and early 1993, found a small article, a short piece about a series of unsettling incidents in the Elm Street area. Reports of a man loitering near the bus stop, occasionally approaching women. No violence reported, just unease. The description was generic. White male, medium build, dark hair. Could be anyone. But the time frame and location were right. Was this their man? A local predator who had escalated? The tape, Miller kept coming back to the tape. The sounds on it, the traffic, Sarah's voice, the man's voice, the payphone, the struggle, the thuds. He asked Ben to analyze the background ambience again. Anything. A piece of music from a passing car? A specific type of engine? Ben worked for days, filtering, enhancing. Most of it was just too low quality, too much general city noise. But then he found something. Right before the man's voice became hard and guttural, just as Sarah was clearly trying to get away, there was a faint, metallic scraping sound, followed by what sounded like a dog barking. A very specific, yappy kind of bark. Not a big dog. And then, almost lost under the start of the struggle, a tiny snippet of music. Just a couple of notes, tinny, like from a cheap car radio. A dog? Music? These were small things. But in a case this cold, small things were all they had. Miller asked Emily if Sarah had a dog, or if any of her friends did. No. Sarah liked animals, but she lived in a small apartment. The focus sharpened. A man who might have been seen loitering on Elm Street. A man who used a room at the Blue Jay Inn, or at least had access to its linens. A man whose voice oozed possessiveness. A man who might have been associated with a small, yappy dog, or had one nearby when he confronted Sarah. Emily remembered something else, a detail she hadn't thought of in years. Sarah had briefly mentioned a man who had tried to talk to her at the bus stop near her work. She'd brushed it off, said he was a bit weird, but harmless. She couldn't recall Sarah giving a name or much of a description, just that he sometimes had a small dog with him. A terrier mix, she thought Sarah had said. A small dog, the yappy bark on the tape. Could it be a match? It was tenuous, so tenuous. But it was more than they had before. The man from the bus stop, the one Sarah called a bit weird, he had a small dog, and the tape had a small dog barking. It was a fragile thread, but Miller felt it tighten. This wasn't just a random attacker. This was potentially someone who had targeted Sarah, watched her, learned her name. Someone whose possessiveness, captured in that whisper, had festered until it exploded into violence. The shadow was starting to take on a more defined shape. He was local. He knew her routine. And he had a small dog. The small dog. The yappy bark. The man Sarah had called a bit weird from the bus stop. These fragments started to coalesce into a chilling picture. This wasn't a random, opportunistic crime. This felt like stalking that had escalated. Miller cross-referenced old police databases and local city records from 1992. Were there any known individuals in the Elm Street area who owned a small terrier or terrier mix and had any prior record, even minor, for harassment or loitering? It was a painstaking search. Records from that era weren't digitized and easily searchable like today. It meant going through physical files, faded printouts. Detective Chen spent weeks in the dusty city archives. He found lists of dog licenses issued in 1991 and 1992 for the neighborhoods around Elm Street. Hundreds of names. He started cross-referencing them with any low-level police interactions. Emily, meanwhile, tried to recall more about the weird man from the bus stop. Sarah had only mentioned him once or twice, casually. He'd tried to strike up conversations. She'd said he seemed lonely, but also a bit intense. She hadn't felt threatened, not seriously, just uncomfortable enough to mention him. Did she say what he looked like? Emily couldn't be sure. Average height, maybe. Dark hair, perhaps. It was like trying to grasp smoke. Then, Chen found a name. Arthur Jennings. Lived in a small apartment building a few blocks from Elm Street. Licensed a terrier mix named Pip in 1991. And in August of 1992, 2 months before Sarah disappeared, Arthur Jennings had been cautioned by police. A woman had complained he was following her from the bus stop, making her uneasy. No charges were filed. He'd claimed it was a misunderstanding. He was just being friendly. Arthur Jennings. The name felt cold. Miller pulled up the old caution report. The description: white male, 32 years old at the time, 5'9", 160 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, matched the vague description of the man seen loitering. Lived near the area. Owned a small dog. Had a documented instance of unsettling behavior towards a woman at a bus stop. This was their strongest lead yet. Arthur Jennings. Was he the voice on the tape? The next step was to find him. Was he still alive? Still in the area? A search of current records showed an Arthur Jennings, now 63 years old, living in a small town about 50 miles away. The age matched. Could it be him? Miller felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a deep caution. After all this time, they couldn't afford to make a mistake. They needed more than just a name and an old dog license. But this was the first time they had a face, a history, however thin, to attach to the shadow. They decided to try and obtain a covert DNA sample from this Arthur Jennings, if possible, to compare against any potential trace evidence from the bedsheet, though hopes for that were slim after so long in the ground. More realistically, they hoped for a chance to hear his voice, to compare it to the tapes. The snippet of music Ben had found on the tape, just a few tinny notes, Ben had been trying to identify it. It was so short, so distorted. But he thought it might be from a popular country song from the early 90s. Did Arthur Jennings listen to country music? It was another small detail to look for. The investigation was closing in. From a whisper on an old 911 call, to a buried tape recorder, to a motel bedsheet, to a yappy dog, and now to a name: Arthur Jennings. Each clue had been a stepping stone across a dark chasm of time. Miller thought about the voice on the tape, the calm, possessive whisper of Sarah, Sarah, then the hard, guttural rage. If Jennings was the man, he was a chameleon, capable of shifting from seemingly harmless to deadly. They found an old DMV photo of Jennings from 1992. Average-looking, unremarkable, the kind of man you'd pass on the street and never notice. Was this the face of the man who had haunted Sarah's last moments? The man Sarah had tried to break away from her sister had said in the prompt's imagined scenario. This wasn't quite that, but it was someone Sarah had noted, someone who made her uneasy. The story elements were aligning. They needed to hear his voice. That was paramount. Miller started to plan how they could approach Arthur Jennings. This encounter would be critical. It could be the moment the truth finally surfaced, or the moment their strongest lead dissolved into nothing. The weight of 31 years pressed down on him. For Sarah, for Emily, they had to know. The plan to approach Arthur Jennings was delicate. They couldn't just barge in accusing him of a 31-year-old murder based on a yappy dog and a whisper. They needed to be smarter than that. Miller decided on a pretext. A cold case review team, looking into several old, unsolved incidents in the Elm Street area from the early 90s. His name had come up as someone who lived in the vicinity at the time. Could he spare a few minutes to answer some general questions? See if he remembered anything unusual from that period? 2 detectives, not Miller himself initially, were sent to Jennings' small, neat house in the quiet town. Jennings, now 63, answered the door. He was thinner than his old DMV photo, his hair gray, but his eyes were the same, brown, watchful. He seemed surprised, but agreed to talk. The detective started casually. The neighborhood, what it was like back then, crime in the area. Did he remember any particular incidents? Jennings was polite. answered in short sentences. His voice was unremarkable, a little raspy with age, perhaps. Was this the voice? It was hard to tell. Age changes voices, and the quality on the tape was poor. They steered the conversation towards the period around October 1992, the disappearance of Sarah. Did he remember that? Jennings frowned slightly. He thought for a moment. Vaguely, he said. A young woman went missing. Sad. He didn't offer more. One of the detectives then mentioned the old complaint about him following a woman from the bus stop. Just routine, he said. We're clearing up old files. Do you recall that? A flicker in Jennings's eyes? Or just Miller's hope? Jennings shook his head. Long time ago, he said. Don't remember anything like that. Probably a misunderstanding. The detectives thanked him for his time and left. They had a recording of his voice from their body cams. It was sent immediately to Ben. The wait was agonizing. Ben compared Jennings's current voice with the voice on the 1992 tape. He analyzed pitch, cadence, formant frequencies. After several hours, he called Miller. It's not a definitive match, detective, he said, his voice tight with frustration. 30 years is a long time. Voices change. But there are similarities. Some unique speech patterns. I can't say it's him, but I also can't say it's not him. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Miller felt a cold wave of disappointment, but he wouldn't give up. Jennings' reaction to the mention of the bus stop incident, it felt dismissive, too quick. They dug deeper into Jennings's life after 1992. He'd moved away from Elm Street about a year later. A string of unremarkable jobs. No further arrests. No major disturbances. He lived quietly. Too quietly? Then, they got a small break from an unexpected source. The old caution report from 1992, the one about Jennings following the woman. It listed his possessions at his apartment at the time, a routine inventory for such complaints back then. Among them, one portable cassette recorder, Panasonic, several country music cassette tapes. A Panasonic cassette recorder. The one found buried was a TDK tape inside an unnamed recorder, but Jennings owned one. And country music. The tinny notes on Sarah's murder tape. It was still circumstantial, but the pieces were clicking louder. Miller decided it was time for a direct confrontation. He would go himself, with Chen, and he would take a copy of the tape, the one with the whisper, the one with Sarah's last moments. They found Jennings working in his small garden. He looked up, startled, as Miller and Chen approached. Mr. Jennings, Miller began, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk to you again about Sarah, the young woman who disappeared in 1992. Jennings' face paled. He put down his trowel. I told your men, I don't know anything. Miller looked him straight in the eye. We found something, Mr. Jennings. Something that belonged to Sarah, or to the person who was with her when she died. We found a tape recording. He saw Jennings flinch. Almost imperceptible, but it was there. We believe you were there, Mr. Jennings. We believe you were the man at the payphone with Sarah. We believe you made this recording. Jennings started to stammer. No, that's crazy. I wasn't. Miller held up a small digital player. I want you to listen to something. He pressed play. First, the hiss. Then the man's voice, low and calm. Don't have to be this way. Then Sarah's strained reply, just leave me alone. Jennings stared at the player as if it were a snake. His breath grew shallow. Then the whisper, Sarah, Sarah. At the sound of that whisper, Arthur Jennings broke. His face crumpled. A choked sob escaped him. He sank to his knees in the dirt of his garden. Yes, he whispered, his voice cracking. unrecognizable from the calm tones on the tape. Yes, it was me. The confession spilled out. He had seen Sarah at the bus stop. He'd become obsessed. He owned a small recorder. Yes, a Panasonic. He liked to record things. Sounds. Sometimes he'd follow people, record their conversations. He knew it was wrong. That night, he'd followed Sarah. He confronted her near the payphone. He had the recorder in his pocket, running. He didn't mean to hurt her, he claimed. He just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand how he felt. But she got scared. She tried to call the police. He panicked. He grabbed her. She fought. He hit her. He didn't remember how many times. Then, she was still. He'd buried the recorder with the motel bedsheet he'd had in his car from a brief stay at the Blue Jay Inn weeks earlier. He didn't know why he buried it. Maybe he wanted to keep that moment. Or maybe he just wanted it gone. And Sarah? Miller's voice was like ice. Where is she, Jennings? Jennings was weeping openly now. A broken old man. He pointed a trembling finger towards a wooded area not far from his old apartment, near the Elm Street neighborhood. There, he sobbed. By the old oak tree. I buried her there. 31 years. The truth, ugly and brutal, was finally out. The whisper had led them to him, the man who owned Sarah's name in his mind, and then stole her life. The monster had a face, and a name, and soon Sarah would finally be brought home. The wooded area near Jennings's old apartment complex had changed, but the large oak tree he described was still there, a silent, ancient witness. Under Miller's grim supervision, and with Jennings now in custody, a forensic team began the excavation. It didn't take long. Just a few feet down, in the hard-packed earth, they found human remains. Emily was there, standing a little way off, supported by a victim's advocate. When Miller approached her, his face etched with sorrow and a grim kind of resolution, she already knew. She didn't need words. The 31-year vigil was over. Sarah had been found. The confirmation came later, through dental records. It was Sarah. After all this time, lost to the earth, she could finally have a proper burial, a name on a stone, a place for her family to mourn. Arthur Jennings was charged with murder. The tapes, Sarah's frantic 911 call with his whisper in the background, and his own horrific recording of the murder, formed the core of the evidence against him. His confession sealed his fate. Justice, delayed for over 3 decades, would finally be served. But what was justice in the face of such a profound and lasting loss? Emily sat with Miller in his office a few weeks later. The trial date was set. Jennings would likely die in prison. She held a small, framed photo of Sarah, young and smiling. That whisper, Emily said, her voice quiet. For all these years, I imagined so many terrible things. But hearing his voice, knowing he was there with her, whispering her name, it was a different kind of horror. And then, that other tape, hearing what he did. She paused, then looked at Miller. But you found her. That little sound, that whisper, it led you to him, and it brought her home. Thank you. Miller simply nodded. There were no easy words. The case was closed, but the echoes would remain. The payphone, long gone. The motel bedsheet, a faded relic. The cassette recorder, its spools forever still. Each object had held a piece of the story, a fragment of Sarah's last moments, a clue to her killer's identity. The still-running recorder, as the initial shock of its discovery had dramatically termed it, hadn't been literally running for 31 years. Its batteries had died within hours or days of being buried, but in a way, it had been running. Its silence, the long unspooling of blank tape after the murder, was a recording of stolen time, of years lost. And the story it held, the truth of Sarah's end, had been waiting, preserved in the dark, until technology and persistence finally brought it to light. The resolution was undeniably bittersweet. Sarah was gone forever, her life cruelly cut short. Her family had endured decades of pain and uncertainty, but now there was an answer. A terrible answer, but an answer nonetheless. The whisper that had been a source of chilling mystery had become the key to unlocking a very human tragedy. The silence in the woods where Sarah lay for so long had been broken, and in that breaking there was a measure of peace, however fragile, however scarred by the years of sorrow. The past could never be undone, but sometimes its darkest secrets could be brought into the light, offering a somber kind of closure. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.